Next story takes us a little further away from our current location and out to the rings of Saturn. And the title is Think Saturn's Rings Are Old, Not So Fast.
No. So, Brody nearly chokes, and AIG thinks the age of Saturn's rings has something to do with the age of the universe. Hi, I'm Jenny, and welcome to Jen's Little Corner.
So out of the University of Colorado Boulder, we have this report that seems to be data that came from the Cassini space mission, which ended in 2017. And as they continue to analyze the data that they have there, they're looking at the different isotopes and different crystals and things that they were able to detect inside of the rings of Saturn as the spacecraft flew through it and then crashed into the atmosphere and disintegrated.
And this is all perfectly true. Part of the final mission brief for Cassini was to dive through the rings of Saturn before flying on to enter Saturn's atmosphere and eventually be crushed and destroyed by the atmosphere. The point of going through the rings first was to collect scientific data on the rings so we could have a better understanding of their composition and their age. Because the fact is, we don't know how long the rings have been around Saturn. We're pretty sure that at some point in the past Saturn didn't have rings. And it'd be nice to try and figure out how long they've actually been there for, how long they've been able to survive there for. And this is a fascinating thing for science, but it bears no markers to exactly how old the universe is.
But they're taking that data now and analyzing it, and they're trying to determine the age of these rings, because this seems to be a great mystery from the evolutionary perspective.
Right.
If Saturn formed at the time of our solar system about 4.5 billion years ago, how have these rings remained so intact and distinct and pristine rather than swirling into one another?
Again, very few scientists actually believe the rings were created with Saturn. The rings are most likely a later event. The most likely cause is some small icy moon moved within the Roche limit of Saturn and was torn apart. And this is what formed the rings. The Roche limit of a large planet or moon is a point out to about 2.5 radii of that planet, where the gravitational tidal forces of the planet are such that a smaller moon or body that goes within that limit will be torn apart by those tidal forces.
Right, and I'll tell you what, they're beautiful. I don't know if you guys have ever taken a telescope and taken a look. Actually, you can see Saturn sometimes with your binoculars.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it really is beautiful.
And I'd have to agree with Bodhi here. Saturn's rings are absolutely gorgeous to look at. And if you can get out there some night with a decent telescope and get a really good look at it, where you can actually see the divisions and see the moons moving around Saturn, you are in for a breathtaking sight.
But, we look at these and we think, the glory of God. When I look out in the heavens, that's just automatically what I think of.
Really, Bodhi? That's all you can think of looking up at the skies? You can't think about how amazing it is that these things coalesce from gas and dust clouds. You can't think of how amazing it is that this icy moon must have got close enough to Saturn to be torn apart and become this beautiful ring system. You can't think how amazing it is that there are these little shepherd moons that hold the rings in position and give us our divisions. That is amazing. You don't need wonder of a creator to look out at the universe and see how amazing it is. The universe is wondrous on its own. Just accept it for its own wonder. No gods needed.
And I want to give glory to God on that. But, as people are looking at these rings, they're thinking in terms of a naturalistic and evolutionary millions of years type of a worldview. And so that's what they're thinking of. Nebular hypothesis and things like that.
You know what, Bodhi? Most scientists and lay people who look out at these things can sometimes think of nebular hypotheses, where we talk about how the planets formed and the sun formed from a nebula. But we don't think about that all the time. We look out at these things and we look at the things that we can discover from them. The whole point of this was to try and age the rings so we knew how long ago they formed and could get an idea of how much longer they'll be around for. There was no concept of proving billions of years for evolution because, quite frankly, no astronomer cares. All they care about is getting the scientific facts of how these things formed, how long they're going to last, what they're made of, how the universe actually works. There's no conspiracy here. Science agrees because all areas of science find the same answers coming at it from different ways.
So I look at this and I go, this is not a problem for an all-powerful God to create it like this.
No, you're quite right, Bodhi. It's not a problem for an all-powerful God to create it like this. But that all-powerful God isn't necessary. We already have a very good understanding of how these things form. In fact, we've seen planets forming around stars in other solar systems, because we look out at the universe and we can see these things. The universe is snapshots of various things in different stages of their stellar evolutions. Therefore, we can get an idea of what our early solar system looked like by looking out at these distant ones which are just forming. So there's no need for your God to have created something 5,000 years ago in this majesty that you keep talking about, because they happen naturalistically billions of years ago.
No, and a beautiful
it's not a
thing for
problem.
us to enjoy.
Absolutely.
And see his creativity in.
So
So as they did this, we can at least give the writers of this story here credit. They gave some tentative language. Oftentimes in scientific articles, we see absolute statements that just can't be backed up. But
Okay, Mr. I honestly can't remember what your name is. Science never does the definitive. Everything is always tentative. Because science isn't about proving things 100%. Science is about getting as close as possible to the truth, but also being falsifiable. If we state something has to be a set way, we're not giving any chance for that to be disproven. And the fact that things can be disproven, that we can test things and find out if they're real, is what gives validity to science.
they say Cassini's dive through the rings during the mission's grand finale in 2017 provided data that was interpreted as evidence that Saturn's rings formed just a few tens of millions of years ago.
Now notice here, Saturn's rings formed a few tens of millions of years ago. That's still a lot longer ago than your 5 to 10,000 years, isn't it?
So at least they're being honest about what they're doing here. They're interpreting data that they use as evidence to support this idea of, or the question of how old are these rings? If the rings are young, then they expect to be able to detect that in the different samples that they took and were able to analyze as the spacecraft moved through. But if they were old, they would get different results. So they're interpreting this data as support for the young.
Again, young is relative. Tens of millions of years is perhaps longer than what humans have been evolved for. There may never have been a humanoid that could have looked up to the sky and not seen rings around Saturn. This is how long ago we are talking about. An awful lot longer ago than your piddly little age of the universe.
But then,
But what they mean by young is not young like biblical time scale. It's
it doesn't seem to
old in
be
their view.
400,000 years or somewhere in that range.
Well, good on Bodhi for saying that science idea of young is not the same as what they mean by young in a biblical sense. So at least he's being somewhat honest there. Although, of course, his partner in crime here just converted his tens of millions of years to 400,000 years, so the dishonesty has just shifted lanes a little bit.
It was the youngest.
Imaginary time.
Yeah.
Oh, was that Bodhi? Was that a snipe? I gotta hear that again.
Imaginary time.
Yeah.
Imaginary time.
Yeah.
Imaginary time.
Yeah.
Time. Imaginary time.
Yeah.
Really, Bodhi? So, our time that is discovered from scientific observation of the universe is imaginary, but your time, which is made up by adding up made up ages in a book that was written by humans several thousand years ago, is real.
And so is this are these rings 4 billion years old, as the standard model would suggest?
Well, that's just an outright lie. Most scientists don't think the rings are as old as Saturn. Most scientists believe that the rings formed much later. The whole idea of Cassini's mission was to try and figure out when they formed and how much longer they will be here for, as I have already said.
And another scientist chimes in and says, well, we think this data supports our view. And that's a good reminder that we all have the same data, we're just interpreting the facts in different ways.
Yes, we can all interpret the facts in different ways. The point is, when we do this, we then have to test our predictions and see if they hold up to observation. And those that do hold up become the scientific consensus of what is actual truth. Truth in science is a consensus of observable phenomenon that we can support through further observation or experimentation. It's not our holy book said so.
And that goes whether you're an evolutionist debating within your own models or evolutionists versus creationists.
Right.
Describing
We're looking
those
at the
different
same
things.
data, and that's one of the big points. One of the things.
Yes, everyone's looking at the same data. The difference is science tries not to look through that data through a bias. Science tries to be as objective as possible. You'll never get rid of all of your own personal biases. We all have them. It's very hard to get rid of them. But that's why science has peer review, so that other people can weed out personal biases. Religious science, though, is totally from the bias of religion and without the benefit of peer review.
Things I noticed, just big picture of this, they're thinking in terms of a naturalistic worldview, naturalism, to ultimately argue for naturalism. And,
there is no arguing for naturalism. Science follows naturalism. Science is all about the natural world and studying it, trying to find out its secrets. As I said before, this isn't about biases here. If science finds something that's different to what they had originally thought, science changes. Religion is dogmatic in its beliefs. Just look at you guys.
logically, that's actually fallacious. Because their actual argument, they're just assuming really what they're trying to prove.
Projection much there, Bodhi. Projection much.
And so, I like to step back and go, hold on, let's start with an absolute authority. God and His Word, they are the absolute authority when it comes to all matters. And God, when He created everything a matter of thousands of years ago, that's not a problem for Him. So
there, just go ahead and prove my point, Bodhi. Oh, God says it. It must be true. It has to be true. It has to be this way. This is dogmatic. This is not looking at the evidence. This is putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, and we would expect those rings to remain fairly intact over that time period and not be distorted.
One of the things it says in here, admittedly, nothing forbids the rings from having been formed very recently with this precise mass and having barely evolved since. However, that would be quite a coincidence.
So yeah, go ahead, laugh at that, Bodhi. But science is being honest here. We don't know. We only have been looking up at Saturn for the last couple of 100 years. In any way that we've been able to see the rings. So if they'd formed 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, we wouldn't know. This is why we're doing the experiments. This is why we collected the data. To try and find out. Yes, it would be a big surprise if they'd only formed in the last 10,000 years. But it's not impossible. So science is being honest here, and your little laugh of derision just shows that you don't understand science at all. Anyway guys, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And please, when you're looking up at the stars at night, try not to choke on your selfie stick.